Hello, everyone. Hello. Hi. I wasn't able to go live on here for a few days because one of my posts got removed, but obviously there was finally a statement made by 7M. And first of all, I just want to say, at the end of the day, they have a right to feel the way that they want to feel. That doesn't negate the way that anyone else feels in this situation. And there was some weird things that they said, I think, in my opinion, that, he's the pastor of the church and he's also a businessman, but they're not together and whatever. Now, some of the things that I have been sharing have come from a lawsuit that was filed back in 2009. The lawsuit involved a former member who claimed a lot of coercion, mind control, brainwashing. Ultimately, the lawsuit failed under a couple of different issues like statute of limitations, freedom of religion, and not being able to prove some of the claims that were made. That doesn't change the fact that when the court made an order, they did find specific things to be true. And I just wanted to share a few things because I was looking at the order that was presented by court. And this is Chung versus Shinn. It's a 2009. The order was filed on September 29th, 2011. And so this is actually a court record. I'm not making this up. This is filed in court. So they found, unfortunately, in the case for this woman that they didn't meet the burden of proof, and some of her claims were past the 3 years of statute of limitations, and others just fell inside of the belief system of being a faithful Christian. So this was something on the 14th page of the order, after they're going through all the different gifts and all the different things that they said, no, they weren't coercive. Yes, no, this didn't happen. Or yes, she gave this money, but no, this didn't qualify as this, that kind of stuff. This is what they actually wrote. So it says, the plaintiff describes and the court finds. So this is interesting. The plaintiff describes and the court finds that Pastor Shinn and Catherine Yee demanded obedience, taught on the consequences of non-obedience, instituted a family system that involved separate girls and boys housing. So this is the court finding verifiably proof that they demanded obedience, taught on the consequences of non-obedience, instituted a family system that involved separate and girls and boys housing, monitored internet usage, and the turning over of financial information to Miss Yee. So they found that they were monitoring their internet usage, according to the court. That says the court finds that they monitored internet usage and turning over of financial information to Miss Yee. In addition, the plaintiff claims and the court finds that the plaintiff, Miss Chung, and others were subject to private and public rebukes in church, whereby Miss Chung was referred to as stupid on one occasion and another member called funky on another occasion. So publicly and privately rebuking was found on, according to the court records, filed September 29th, 2011. They said that 2 church members testified that none of these things occurred, or they were rare or overstated. And they found that these church members' credibility was lacking. They completely disregarded the testimony of one of these church members. It says the plaintiff testified that the plaintiff's phone and computers were monitored by the church. the court finds that Ms. Chung did not prove the installation of a monitoring system on her computer, though some evidence was offered that other church members believed that something was installed on their computers. The court finds that she did not live with these other members except for 2 to 3 month period with Ms. Yee and did not share a computer with any of them. So she only lived for like 2 to 3 months, according to the court, with the church members. So this is another interesting thing that I found the court found. The court finds that the more loyal church members were expected to absolutely obey the teachings of the church, and that other church members were subject to public rebuking in Shekinah Church. The court also finds that the plaintiff did not receive donation receipts, but finds that the plaintiff never asked for receipts. The court also finds that the allegation of the plaintiff's phone uses monitoring by the church pre-signed checks. The court also finds that the allegation of plaintiff's phone usage monitoring by the church, pre-signed checks, and obedience systems were not major factors in her giving motivation. So even though they were monitoring her phones and she did pre-sign checks and she did follow an obedience system, they said that those weren't her primary motivations. So at the end of the day, she did not win, but it seems like the court found some of what she said to be true. And it still is, again, kind of that idea that pre-signing checks, and I feel like these groups are so good at this in that they don't, okay. They said there was insufficient evidence that she was brainwashed, or that any physical duress had been taken, or that she was kidnapped, or that she was deprogrammed. They said the court finds the defendant's behavior was outside the norm for clergy, and that some of the conduct complained of could be considered to be manipulative and for the self-interest of persons involved in the church. The court also finds that Robert Shinn and Catherine Yee acted in concert in connection with their church activities, and that Shekinah Church has practices that bordered on coercion. So they say that they couldn't conclusively prove that she was brainwashed. I told you that that's super hard to prove. But they did say that his behavior was outside of the norm of clergy. It was considered manipulative and for the self-interest of the people involved in the church, that they worked in concert, and that their practices bordered on coercion. So they said that she could not prove that she was incapacitated for that time. They didn't find some of her testimony credible. They also traveled to Korea a bunch of times, but that Robert never traveled with them. And let's see, there was something else in here I wanted to tell you about. Okay, this is interesting. The evidence was uncontroverted. I don't know, what does that mean? Uncontroverted, that plaintiff and defendants engaged in a scheme involving a series of illegal wire transfers. What does uncontroverted mean? From Korea to the church to avoid and even evade paying taxes of a legitimate government Korea with respect to transfers. So it's not refuted. Okay. So it's not refuted that they engaged in a scheme involving a series of illegal wire transfers from Korea to the church to avoid and even evade paying taxes. So that's what the court finds. They also found that it was not appropriate. It was not an appropriate way to transfer money, and that all of them engaged in this scheme. The court says they all knew it was a scheme to transfer money from the parents' accounts through these intermediaries in Korea to avoid taxes. So they found that they were doing something in a scheme, but that she was also a part of it. So it's not disputed. Got it. So they were basically, the court found that they were doing illegal transfers to avoid paying taxes. So no criminal charges came out of that, but that's what the court found, and they said it was undisputed. The teachings of the way that the church worked of donating also were like, they found one of her motivations in that she deeply revered Robert Shinn. Let me see here. And then they went into the legal arguments of like how undue influence happens, and they just said that she did not meet these burdens. I just thought it was interesting that they said that they confirmed some of the things that they were talking about. It says not all influence, or even though strong, is undue influence. That is term is used in gift litigation. Standing alone, sympathy, affection, friendship, attachment by sentiment or desire to gratify the wishes of ones who beloved, respected, or trusted, or blah, blah, blah. A person may suggest, advise, and give good reason, but ultimately it's up to the person to give the money. Let's see, what else can I find? So they said that she was never physically taken away from any facility that was owned by them, never without a car, phone, or access to her friends or family. That she gave full financial authority to the defendants and made decisions of her own free will. It says that she never lived in any of the church properties except for a 2 to 3 month period when she lived with Catherine Yee. She was sometimes alone with her own attorney when some of these transfers were being made. Statute of limitations was a huge problem because most of the transfers happened between later than 2006 and 7. So she couldn't, after that, really meet the burden for the ones that happened before then. There was no fraud in terms of concealing what happened. She knew exactly what was going on and consented with her own free will. This is not a situation where the plaintiff was in a residential compound or constantly under the coercion or a captive situation. She freely gave properties away. There was constitutional limitations because of the church. She said that it was the teachings of the church that led her to do these things. She alleged that Shinn manipulated her and threatened judgment, hell, and other consequences if plaintiff and other church members did not obey the teaching, if they did not tithe, if they did not open up and be honest with God, if they did not honor God, and if they did not pass the money test of greed. Although the plaintiff claimed not to have free will, that her gifts were made under duress due to the fraud perpetuated by Shinn and the church, the claims would necessarily require the court to examine an interpretation of the Bible on the subject of tithing, which was applied by Pastor Shinn, and then make a determination on whether that interpretation rose to the level of undue influence. And it says a civil court is no position to make a judicial interpretation determination of what is and not correct biblical interpretation. For instance, in considering the alleged plaintiff's fear, defendant's perceived threats, and public rebuke, a court would need to delve into the issues of whether such statements and conduct was an actual threat for them to donate or a literal interpretation of the Bible. So they don't want to get involved with the Bible. It's interesting because they're saying they're not saying it didn't happen. They're just saying they can't make a determination, or they're not saying anything either way. So that's kind of the problem in situations like this. They would not make any sort of inquiry into the will of God, open up with God, obey God, and whether or not it was actually valid teachings. So at the end of the day, they confirmed some of the things, that there was monitoring, that people lived in housing, that they opened up their finances to the church. But ultimately, because it was under a church, she couldn't, she was a true believer, and they said she wasn't brainwashed. It's so hard in cases like this because it's true. Physically, she probably didn't look anything of the sort. But they did say that it was manipulative and bordering on coercion. And in the world of religion, unfortunately, this is kind of where we are in the state of the United States, which is why financial issues like this are hard to prove, and frequently why these types of groups only will get in trouble when bigger crimes are happening, or if they can actually prove any sort of conversion of funds of the church into business. Oh, there was something about the businesses in here I wanted to tell you too, about working, because he had mentioned they mentioned in their statement that they were not connected to the church, and that it was all separate, and that he is a CEO of the church, but also CEO of the company. Okay, so this is what they wrote on the 4th page. It says, at the end of 1999, she testified that Pastor Shinn's teaching emphasized giving, and that the more you give, the more you receive from God. That Shekinah had a destiny to fund the gospel, and that to fund the gospel, we were going to set up big corporations, and everybody was going to work to make money. Pastor also taught that greed comes from evil, and that the church members should be open with God through their finances and free from money, and pass the money test. So they admit that he did set up corporations to fund the gospel. So the thing that I think is really bizarre about their statement today was that they said that there's people that are part of this that you don't have to be a church member to join. But every single one of the dancers that has been highlighted is a part of the church. So is that true? I mean, could someone that doesn't want to be a part of the church really become a member of 7M? Ultimately, what would have to happen in a situation like this, I believe, is that if they were going to get into any sort of criminal side of things, there would have to be crimes that are found either through the IRS, through tax evasion, or through money laundering, or through conversion of nonprofit funds to for-profit world. There's a lot of ways that you can do this. There's also, if there's been crimes against people that are worse in nature. Even though you don't necessarily know who the people are, it doesn't change the fact that the stories and the information that's coming out about it is horrible. Some of you suggested that there's not kids involved. I will say, yes, there are. We just haven't gotten to that part of the story yet. In the United States, you're free to practice a religion, and that means that anyone that claims to be a pastor can say that this is what their interpretation of the Bible is. And if you believe them and follow that and give them money, the government will say that you're practicing your religion, and they're not going to want to get involved in that. Unfortunately, there's people that are, fortunately and unfortunately, there are good people that are in religion. There's actually a lot of good people that are in religion. There's a lot of religious organizations that, even though they've had a lot of like scandals and troubles, they also equally do a lot of good for the community and give back to the community. So you can't say that like every single religious organization is bad. It's just, there's always going to be people that are like in the system that are using it to their advantage. Right now, I wouldn't know how to say what is happening because I don't really know the full scope. But like, if we were to base it based on what the judge would rule in this case, based on today, they would kind of, you know, if the same claims were made, it would be, you know, well, you're just practicing your religion. So the long story is you have to find other crimes that are happening. In the case of like NXIVM, and I'm not comparing this to NXIVM. Really, I think hard for some people to get invested in this story because it's with people you don't know. But if we're going to be completely honest, most of us knew nothing about half of the people that were in NXIVM or even other groups like, you know, Jones, like Jim Jones's group or like David Koresh. I'm simply stating like in the case of NXIVM, there was a lot of things happening similar to this. But ultimately, the cult was taken down not because of that, but because of the sex crimes. So there's other ways and other crimes that happen. And if you think of it like with Warren Jeffs from the FLDS, that's another example. Like they all lived in a commune basically in Colorado City, Short Creek, in like on the border of Arizona and Colorado. And they lived and communed all of their money together. And technically, he dictated how that money was distributed throughout the group. Theoretically, you could say, yes, there was probably a level of coercion there because he's claiming to be a prophet, but then they're also following their religion, so they believe this, right? But how did they get him wasn't through the practice of the religion, but it was that he was raping 12-year-olds, right? And marrying children. Arizona and Utah, sorry. So you have to find other crimes that are not based in the religious practice. And you're not, when it comes to crimes of sex and child exploitation, you don't get to hide behind religion for that. Yeah, and sometimes what happens in these types of cases is because people are such diehard believers in the situation, you start to think like, well, they might, by the time they get out, there's nothing that they can do, and there's no way of getting, you're past the statute of limitations. I think really the biggest issue is that you want to make sure that you're not falling for these kinds of promises. You want to make sure that you're not falling victim to someone telling you that they are the prophet, that they should be obeyed, or that full obedience is required. That no, you know, you should have little warning signs up that anyone that wants to try to control all facets of your life is not someone that you might want to have involved in your life. You know, you can't also force someone to get out of a cult, but you can also put out information so that other people don't fall victim. And in the case of this situation, the biggest thing is that you don't want other young dancers getting roped into a situation where they might fall victim to being under a very controlling environment. So, but yes, I mean, you have to find actual crimes. You'd have to find crimes of tax evasion, money laundering. Sometimes these groups end up getting caught because of the way that they're structuring and not paying money or avoiding ways of paying taxes. I mean, there's lots of different ways that these organizations can come down.